World War I was unlike any conflict before it, a brutal collision of industrial might and human endurance. Soldiers found themselves entrenched in a new kind of warfare, trapped in muddy ditches that stretched for miles across scarred landscapes. These trenches were both fortress and prison, shelter from the deadly hail of bullets and shells, but also a place of relentless suffering. Life in the trenches was a brutal routine of waiting, fighting, and enduring. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 was one of the bloodiest battles in history, designed to break the stalemate on the Western Front. It began with a week-long artillery barrage meant to destroy German defenses. On July 1st, the British Army launched a massive infantry assault, but the Germans were deeply entrenched and waiting. The machine guns opened fire with devastating effect, cutting down thousands of men in minutes. Nearly 20,000 British soldiers were killed on the first day alone, with tens of thousands more wounded. The horrors of that day revealed the deadly reality of modern warfare and the brutal cost of offensive tactics against fortified positions. Yet, despite the carnage, soldiers showed remarkable courage. They endured days of soaking rain and freezing cold, their uniforms sodden and caked with mud. Rats swarmed the trenches in the thousands, gnawing at food scraps and sometimes biting the men themselves. Trench foot became a common and feared affliction as soldiers stood for hours in cold, waterlogged mud. Illness spread quickly in the cramped, filthy conditions. Dysentery, typhus, and influenza claimed many lives. Amid this misery, soldiers clung to small comforts. Letters from home were treasured, read and reread in the quiet moments. Men shared stories, sang songs, and tried to hold on to their humanity despite the daily horrors. Humor, even dark and grim, was a coping mechanism. Jokes and nicknames lightened the unbearable weight of fear. The Battle of Verdun was another brutal example of trench warfare's deadly grind. For 10 months, French and German soldiers faced each other across a desolate no-man's land. The artillery bombardment was relentless, turning the battlefield into a moonscape of craters and rubble. Every day, men were forced to endure deafening shell fire, losing friends and comrades to explosions and sniper fire. Despite this, French troops famously held their ground with fierce determination. Acts of heroism and sacrifice became legendary, with soldiers charging enemy lines and defending positions against overwhelming odds. Night patrols were some of the most perilous moments in trench life. Soldiers crawled out into no man's land under cover of darkness, seeking enemy sentries or placing mines. The silence was tense and suffocating, broken only by distant gunfire or the whisper of the wind. One wrong step could mean death, whether from enemy bullets or hidden mines. The Battle of Passchendaele, or the Third Battle of Ypres, was infamous for its appalling mud. The relentless rain turned the battlefield into a swamp, where men and horses sank deep into the muck. Artillery craters filled with water, creating impassable pools that swallowed soldiers whole. Despite these conditions, commanders pressed on, driven by strategic goals and the hope of breaking German lines. For the soldiers, it was a nightmare of exhaustion, hunger, and relentless danger. In the trenches, soldiers also faced psychological torment. The constant threat of death, the screams of the wounded, and the sight of fallen comrades took a heavy toll. Many suffered from shell shock, an early term for what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some men became numb, others broken by the relentless stress. Yet, amid the horror, camaraderie flourished. Men shared their meager rations, helped tend wounds, and comforted each other during long, dark nights. They celebrated small victories, a letter from home, a quiet moment without bombardment, a shared cigarette. These bonds, forged in suffering, were lifelines that helped many survive the endless nightmare. The trenches represented the cruel paradox of World War I, a place where technology and modern warfare met human endurance and spirit, where death and despair existed alongside hope and brotherhood. Soldiers' lives were a constant battle, not only against the enemy, but against the mud, the cold, the disease, and the creeping fear. Their stories remain a testament to courage in the face of unimaginable hardship, and a reminder of the cost of war that shaped the world for generations to come. The cold bite of November air stabbed through Private Samuel Worthington's woolen tunic as he staggered through the muddy communication trench. The wooden duckboards beneath his boots were slippery, half sunken into the brown ooze that swallowed everything. His knuckles were white from gripping his rifle, and the air was saturated with the stench of rot, smoke, and something unnameable. Death, perhaps. This was the Western Front. This was France, and this was his first taste of the war. He had arrived at the front only the day before, a green recruit fresh from England, cheeks still round and eyes still bright with the naive hope of adventure. But that boy had died the moment Samuel had stepped off the lorry and smelled the front line. In his place now stood a young man, already beginning to understand the meaning of war, and he hadn't even seen the enemy yet. As Samuel pushed forward, his heavy pack dragging him down, he passed men who looked like they had stepped out of hell itself. Their uniforms were caked in dried mud and filth. Their eyes were hollow, ringed with dark shadows from sleepless nights. One of them, an older man with a thick beard and a 1,000-yard stare, gave him a nod. "You knew?" he rasped. Samuel nodded. "Good luck. You'll need it." There was no trace of sarcasm in the man's voice, just weary resignation. Eventually, the trench opened up into the front line. Barbed wire coiled like some malicious creature overhead, and the sky was bruised gray, low and heavy with clouds that threatened more rain. The earth here was nothing but sludge. Sandbags lined the parapet, some torn, revealing the black soil within. The smell was stronger here, acrid, a mix of sweat, unwashed bodies, latrines, and something metallic in the air that Samuel would later realize was blood. "Private Worthington, over here," barked a corporal, his voice cutting through the murmur of men and distant artillery. Samuel scurried over, nearly losing his balance as his boots sank ankle-deep into the muck. The corporal, a man named Hargreaves, was short and broad, with a scar running down the side of his face. "You'll bunk with 3rd Section. That's Taylor, Jenkins, Murdoch, and Davies. You'll take watch from midnight to 2. Try not to fall asleep. Jerry likes to raid around then." "Yes, Corporal," Samuel said, trying to keep the tremble out of his voice. He found his new mates huddled around a brazier, warming their hands over the weak flames. They looked up briefly, offered grunts of greeting, and then returned to their silent ritual. Jenkins offered him a tin mug of tea, dark and bitter. "You from London?" Jenkins asked after a long moment. "Manchester." "First day?" Samuel nodded. "Well," Jenkins said, "enjoy the quiet while it lasts." And just as he said it, the distant rumble of artillery grew louder, closer, until it was a full barrage. The trench seemed to shake with every impact. The men didn't flinch. Samuel did. He clutched his helmet and crouched low, his heart hammering in his chest. "Don't worry, lad," Murdoch said, with a half smile. "That's just the morning hate. Fritz likes to remind us he's still there." "Get used to the noise," Davies added. "Eventually, you won't even hear it anymore." But Samuel wasn't sure he he could get used to any of it. Not the noise, not the mud, not the rats, the size of small dogs that darted along the trench floor, not the constant damp that seeped into his boots and turned his toes numb, not the knowledge that at any moment a shell could fall from the sky and end his life without warning. That night, as the men settled into their dugouts, cramped holes carved into the trench walls, reinforced with timber and lined with straw, Samuel took up his watch. He stood on the fire step, peering over the parapet into no man's land, the vast expanse of mud, craters, and broken wire that separated them from the enemy. The moon was veiled behind clouds, casting everything in a pale, sickly light. Shapes moved in the distance, ghosts or shadows, or maybe just tricks of the eyes. His fingers were numb. His breath came in clouds. He strained to listen for any sound of movement. A rat scurried past his foot. His stomach growled, but he'd already eaten his ration, a chunk of hardtack and a bit of corned beef. It sat heavy in his belly, and he thought of home, of the warm kitchen where his mother used to bake pies, of the fire that crackled in the hearth, of the scent of fresh bread. The memory was almost painful in its sweetness. A shot rang out. Samuel froze. He couldn't tell where it had come from. Left flank? Right? Was it an enemy sniper? One of their own? A voice hissed behind him. "Don't stand up like that, you bloody fool. You'll get your head blown off." He dropped back behind the parapet, heart in his throat. The rest of the night passed in a blur of cold and silence. When Jenkins came to relieve him, Samuel could barely feel his legs. "Good job, Private," Jenkins said with a nod. "Still breathing, ain't you?" Samuel managed a weak smile. He crawled into the dugout and collapsed onto the straw, exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. He didn't even notice the lice that crawled through his uniform or the rats that sniffed at his boots. He was too tired to care. When he woke, it was to the sound of shouting. "Gas! Gas! Gas!" Panic surged through the trench. Samuel fumbled for his gas mask, hands shaking. He got it on just in time to see the greenish-yellow cloud rolling toward them, hugging the ground. Men were coughing, retching, some screaming. The mask felt tight, suffocating, but it was his only shield. The gas passed quickly, but the damage was done. 2 men down the trench weren't so lucky. They hadn't gotten their masks on in time. They lay twitching, foam around their mouths. "Welcome to the front," Hargreaves said grimly as the bodies were dragged away. The rest of the day was spent repairing damage to the trench, reinforcing the walls with new sandbags, draining water where possible. Samuel's hands were raw by the end of it, but there was no rest. The work was constant, monotonous, grueling. That night they listened as artillery thundered in the distance. Someone played a harmonica. Jenkins read a letter from home, his voice soft. "She says my boys started walking," he said with a wistful smile. "Can't believe it. Didn't even get to see it." No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Samuel lay in the dugout, staring at the timbers above his head. Every creak made him flinch. He thought about time, how it seemed to stretch and shrink here. Minutes felt like hours. Days bled into one another. There was no past, no future, only now, only survival. The war had just begun for him, and already he was forever changed. The rain had returned before dawn. It came in sheets, not drops, turning the trench into a brown river of muck. Samuel stood, ankle-deep in it, his boots long since soaked through, his toes numb. The sky above was a pale smear of grey, indistinguishable from the smoke that still lingered from the last artillery barrage. Every breath he took was damp, cold, and tinged with the scent of rot. Not even the cigarettes the men passed around could drown it out. He clutched his rifle to his chest, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that barely helped anymore. Every surface was slick with grime, every corner of the trench vibrating with a soft, living filth. Rats darted between boots, fearless, swollen from feasting on the dead, buried beneath the mud. Samuel saw one, perched atop a broken helmet, chewing on something pale and unrecognizable. He turned away and tried not to gag. "Don't bother staring," Jenkins said from beside him, voice hoarse from smoke and cold. "They'll be crawling over you soon enough. Might as well name 'em and make peace with it." Murdoch, always the dark-humored one, chuckled from down the line. "I call the big one Fred. He's got a scar across his nose, mean little bastard. Bit my ear 2 nights ago." The others laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because laughter was all they had left. In a place like this, you either laughed or you screamed. Sometimes you did both. As the morning crawled by, the cold sank deeper into Samuel's bones. The trench was lined with rotting sandbags, collapsing into themselves under the weight of water and neglect. The duckboards groaned beneath every step, brittle with age and moisture. Some places had no boards at all anymore, just open mud. They called those spots gravy holes. Step wrong, and you'd sink up to your waist. "Trench foot's creeping up on me again," Davies muttered, pulling off his boot to expose a swollen raw foot wrapped in filthy bandage. "Can't feel my toes. Can't tell if they're still there." Jenkins leaned over, squinting. "You'll know when they fall off. That's usually the sign." Samuel said nothing. His own feet were wet and stiff, but he hadn't dared peel back the socks to check. He was too afraid of what he might see. The medic had passed by earlier, half asleep, carrying a satchel with fewer supplies than a schoolboy's lunch. "Rub 'em with whale oil," he'd muttered, "or pray, if that's more your speed." Around midday, the rations came. A pair of exhausted men hauled crates down the trench, passing out tins of bully beef, hard biscuits, and a weak onion stew that barely warmed the stomach. They called it trench champagne. Samuel picked at his with numb fingers, spooning cold fat into his mouth as the rain soaked his helmet. "I had a roast last winter," he whispered, more to himself than anyone. "Potatoes, lamb, mint sauce, and warm gravy. God, I can still taste it." Murdoch leaned in with a grin. "I had a steak, a bloody red steak, women on both arms, and jazz in the air. Now look at us, lads, dining with rats and dancing in the rain." That earned a laugh, louder this time, but it faded as quickly as it came. A shell landed somewhere behind them, distant but deep. Everyone paused, waiting to see if more followed. Sometimes it was just one, sometimes it was a dozen, but the quiet returned. Only the slow drizzle and the slurp of water through mud. As afternoon fell, Hargreaves gathered them for maintenance duty. They formed a chain gang, moving sandbags, rebuilding collapsed corners, draining water into sump pits. It was miserable work, but it gave the body something to do. The mind, too. "I used to build houses back in Sheffield," Jenkins said, tossing a fresh sandbag atop the wall. "Clean ones, with stone and brick, not bloody bags of dirt." "I drove horses," Davies added, "delivering milk. God, I miss the sound of hooves on pavement. Not this sludge." Murdoch glanced at Samuel. "What about you, kid? What did you do before this bloody vacation?" Samuel hesitated. "I was in school. Wanted to be a teacher." The others nodded slowly. "Poor bastard," Jenkins said softly. Then they went back to work. By sunset, the sky glowed faintly with a sick light that barely pierced the haze, a crimson smear across grey clouds. It was the most colour they'd seen in days. A rat squealed in the distance. Artillery thumped like a heartbeat. That night, Samuel took fire watch again. Midnight to 2, the worst hours, the coldest, the quietest, the loneliest. He stood on the fire step, peering over the parapet. No man's land lay ahead like a frozen wasteland. Craters filled with black water, barbed wire twisted like iron vines. Somewhere out there were the Germans, sleeping, watching, maybe crawling toward the trench at that very moment. He adjusted his helmet and clutched his rifle. Every shadow looked like movement. Every gust of wind, a whisper. Behind him, the trench breathed. Men snoring, shivering, muttering in their sleep. A cough echoed down the line. A match flared briefly, then vanished. Samuel's hands were shaking. He couldn't tell if it was the cold or the fear anymore. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. His sister's last letter. He read it again, though he'd memorized every word. She talked about their dog, Buster, and how he still waited by the gate every day. She said their mother cried when his name was mentioned. She told him to be brave. He folded it carefully and tucked it back inside his coat. Then, for a brief moment, he let his guard down. He closed his eyes, just for a second. A shot cracked through the night. Samuel dropped instinctively, heart racing. He pressed his face into the muddy wall, breath ragged. "Sniper," someone whispered from farther down the trench. Then silence. He stayed low the rest of the shift, never blinking, never moving. Every second stretched into a lifetime. When Jenkins finally came to relieve him, Samuel looked him dead in the eye. "I thought I was dead," he said. Jenkins nodded. "Join the club." And then he disappeared into the shadows, rifle slung low, boots sloshing softly through the trench water. Samuel sat alone on the fire step, the stars barely visible above the wire. The war hadn't even begun for real yet, but already the silence was louder than the guns. The fog came thick and early, rolling over the parapet like a ghostly tide. It crept through the trench like smoke, swallowing sound, muffling breath, smothering light. Samuel could barely see 3 feet in front of him. Shapes blurred into nothing. Voices became whispers. It was the kind of fog that made men vanish. Jenkins stood beside him on the fire step, muttering under his breath as he wiped condensation from the edge of his rifle sight. "You know what this means," he said, voice low. Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice. Everyone knew what the fog meant. Raid weather. Murdoch passed by, his bayonet already fixed. No words, just a glance. They were waiting for the order, waiting to be sent into the grey unknown. Inside the dugout, Corporal Hargreaves laid out a rough map on a sandbag table. His finger stabbed a point along a torn trench line, scratched in charcoal. "They're thinning out along Sector G," he said. "Command wants prisoners. Intel. Anything." Davies snorted. "Command always wants something. Why don't they come dig through the fog themselves?" "Because that's what we're for," Hargreaves replied, unbothered. "Grab your kit. You 5 go at midnight. In and out, quiet. Bring back a body if you can't get a man." No one argued. There was no room for that here. Orders were blood. They soaked everything. Samuel sharpened his bayonet against a broken brick, watching sparks jump like fireflies in the dark. His hands were steady. His heart wasn't. He had never been on a raid before. He had heard stories, though, whispers of knives in the dark, of throats slit before a sound could escape, of boots sinking into craters filled with corpses of men who never came back, not because they were dead, but because they had simply disappeared. He checked his revolver twice. Then again, it was heavy and unfamiliar, more for show than comfort. Jenkins handed him a strip of black cloth. "For your face," he said, "no shine. We don't want Fritz to see your baby cheeks glowing." The others chuckled, not with humor, with habit. They painted their faces, blackened their rifles, tied strips of cloth around their sleeves to identify each other in the fog. Murdoch carried wire cutters. Davies, a flare gun. Samuel took nothing extra. He didn't want more weight to carry back. When midnight came, they crawled over the parapet like shadows. No man's land was dead silent. The fog muffled even the crunch of boots against frozen mud. Their breath vanished into the haze. The only sound was their own heartbeat, pounding like war drums inside their skulls. Barbed wire loomed ahead, silent and coiled. Murdoch crouched low and cut it clean, lifting a section like a curtain. They slid through, one by one, into enemy ground. Samuel's senses were sharp. Every step was a thunderclap in his mind. Every shape might be a man. Every whisper of wind, a German waiting with a bayonet. They reached the lip of the enemy trench. After 20 minutes of crawling and ducking between shell craters, it was shallower than theirs. Poorly lit, no movement. 3 down, Hargreaves mouthed, pointing into the trench. Davies nodded and slipped in first. The others followed. Samuel's boots touched the floor with a squelch. He thought he stepped in water. He looked down. It was blood. His breath caught, but he kept moving. The fog had seeped in here too, clinging to the trench walls, floating just above the duckboards. There were no Germans. Not yet. Then, a cough. To the left. Close. They froze. Jenkins raised his rifle slowly. Murdoch signaled. 2 fingers pointed around the corner. They advanced like ghosts. There were 2 Germans at the far end of the trench, huddled around a weak brazier. One had a cigarette in his mouth. The other was laughing softly. Davies moved first. He raised the butt of his rifle and brought it down on the first man's head with a dull thud. The second turned to cry out, but Jenkins had already buried his bayonet deep into his stomach. The man gurgled, arms flailing, and fell against the brazier, snuffing the coals. The trench was quiet again. Samuel stared at the bodies. His stomach churned. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't even aimed his weapon. "You good?" Jenkins whispered. Samuel nodded. He wasn't sure if it was a lie. They dragged one of the bodies back up over the parapet and began their retreat. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it had thickened. No flares lit the sky. No gunfire broke the silence, until a flare finally screamed upward from their own line. Then chaos erupted. Machine gun fire spat from the German line, wild and panicked. Tracer rounds zipped through the fog like glowing needles. Bullets hissed past their heads. Someone screamed behind them. Murdoch, maybe, or Davies. Samuel didn't look back. He just ran. He leapt over barbed wire, boots catching once, nearly sending him face first into the mud. Jenkins grabbed his arm, yanked him free, and pushed him forward. They rolled into their trench, landing hard, bodies soaked, lungs heaving. Hargreaves was waiting. "Where's Murdoch?" No one answered. "God damn it," he growled, looking back toward no man's land. But the fog had swallowed it whole again. They lay in silence for a while. Mud caked into their ears and coats. Blood stained their gloves. The German body was dumped near the medic station. No one asked his name. No one cared. Samuel sat beside the dugout wall, unable to speak. His hands were still shaking. Not from cold, not anymore. He had seen death before. But tonight, he had stood in it. "First one's the hardest," Jenkins said quietly, sitting beside him. "It never gets easier. But the first, it stays with you." Samuel didn't reply. He couldn't. His throat burned. His eyes stung. He wasn't crying. It just felt that way. The morning came with no sunrise, just a paler shade of grey behind the clouds. The fog had retreated slightly, but its damp fingers still clung to every surface. The trench smelled of wet earth, cordite, and something fouler beneath it all. Samuel sat on an overturned crate, hunched over, boots soaked and hands caked in dried blood and clay. He hadn't slept. No one had. Jenkins passed by, eyes ringed red, his face older than it was yesterday. He offered Samuel a half-smoked cigarette and a nod. No words were exchanged. Words were a luxury they couldn't afford this morning, not after last night. Murdoch was gone, vanished into the fog and bullets. 1 minute with them, the next gone. No one said his name. They didn't have to. His absence was louder than gunfire. Davies sat beside the brazier, his helmet resting in his lap. His hands trembled as he tried to roll a cigarette, fingers too stiff from the cold and from the things he'd done in the dark. Samuel watched him for a moment before reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, worn envelope. His sister's handwriting was fading from the damp, the corners frayed. He had read it every day for 2 weeks. Now the words felt more like echoes. "Dear Sam, I hope you're keeping warm. I hope they're feeding you well. Mum says hello, and Dad checks the papers every morning for news from the front. Buster's still waiting by the garden gate. Every evening, like he knows you'll come home walking down the lane. You'll come back, won't you?" Samuel folded it slowly. He hadn't written back. He didn't know what to say anymore. What could he tell them? That he slept beside corpses and rats? That he saw a man's insides last night when a bayonet went too deep? That Murdoch screamed once and never again? He tucked the letter back into his breast pocket and exhaled slowly. A shell exploded somewhere down the line, but no one flinched. They were used to it now. Shells were background noise, like wind in the trees or footsteps in snow. Corporal Hargreaves called them together shortly after noon. He stood beneath a ragged tarp that dripped cold rain down the back of his collar. "We've been rotated to reserve duty," he said without expression. "Pack your kit. We move out in 20 minutes. No one cheered. No one even smiled. Being in reserve didn't mean safety. It just meant different work. Digging, repairing roads, burying the dead. Samuel and Jenkins threw their things together, stuffing what little gear they had into their packs. Everything smelled of mold and gunpowder. Lice crawled across seams like they owned the place. Samuel scratched absent-mindedly at his neck, too tired to bother squashing them. They moved out in a single line, ducking under barbed wire and trudging along the communication trench. Boots squelched through knee-deep mud. Rain drizzled from above, cold and thin like needles. The sky never changed. It was always grey, always empty. They passed a medical dugout along the way. Inside, the moans of the wounded leaked out like steam from a broken pipe. One man thrashed against his stretcher, eyes rolled white, mouth wide in a silent scream. Gas, maybe, or shrapnel in the lungs. Samuel looked away. Jenkins didn't. They reached the reserve trench near dusk. It was deeper, wider, with more timber and fewer rats. But the air still smelled the same. Even back here, Death had soaked into the walls. They were assigned to dig detail that night. The rain had collapsed part of the western wall, so they dug and dug until their hands blistered and their backs screamed. It was honest work at least. No screaming, no shooting, just dirt and silence. That night, Samuel found a corner to rest in. He took out a pencil and a scrap of paper from a ration tin. He stared at it for a long time. Then he began to write. Dear Lily, it's raining again. It always rains here. The mud is everywhere, even in my dreams. I haven't seen the sun in days. Sometimes I forget what warmth feels like. He paused. We lost another man last night. His name was Murdoch. You'd have liked him. He told jokes even when there was nothing to laugh at. He once pulled a rat from his boot and named it General. He said he'd take it home with him, give it a medal. Now he's gone. Just like that. Another pause. Don't tell Mum. Don't tell anyone. Just keep the fire lit back home. Keep Buster by the gate. I'll try to find my way back. He stopped writing, folded the page, tucked it next to his sister's letter. He didn't know if he'd send it. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe never. Jenkins sat nearby, carving something into the wood of a broken rifle stock. Samuel leaned over. What's that? He asked. Names, Jenkins said. Everyone we've lost. Keeps me honest. Samuel stared at the etchings. Tiny, crooked. Murdoch's was the last one carved. The wind picked up around midnight, howling like wolves through the trench boards. The cold cut deeper tonight, even wrapped in blankets, even curled against the wall. Samuel's teeth chattered. He didn't complain. No one did. Complaining didn't keep you warm. He dreamed of fire, of the hearth in his mother's kitchen, of hands pulling him from the cold, of laughter. He woke to gunfire. Not far, just beyond the rise of the hill, tracers lit the sky in brief arcs. A flare burst overhead, painting the trench white for a heartbeat, then gone. Everyone stirred. No orders yet, just waiting. Then the call came down. Casualties in the forward trench. Reserve was to send stretchers and men. Samuel and Jenkins were the first to volunteer. They crawled through the mud with two others, stretcher between them, ducking low beneath the whine of shells. They found the forward trench half collapsed, smoke rising from a black crater in the middle. Two men were alive, one unconscious, the other with his arm shredded to ribbons, crying for his mother. Samuel lifted the stretcher. The wounded man screamed. The mud sucked at their boots. Shells cracked nearby. They carried him back in silence. By the time they returned, dawn was clawing at the sky. Pink, then gray again. Samuel sat alone afterward, covered in blood that wasn't his. He looked at his hands. They were shaking again. He didn't feel scared anymore. He just felt empty. Like the shells. Hollow. The silence broke at 4:17 a.m. It started with a sound like a mountain tearing in half. A single shell screamed across the sky and slammed into the ridge behind the reserve trench. The ground shook, like it had been punched by the fist of God. Samuel jolted awake, his back against the timber wall, boots half on, rifle in his lap. He blinked into the darkness as another shell fell, closer this time, and then came the rest. It was as if the heavens opened and poured fire onto the earth. Shell after shell crashed into the lines, some behind, some ahead, some directly on top of them. The sound was a living thing. It howled and tore and thundered. There was no rhythm to it, no pattern, only chaos. Jenkins was already moving, pulling on his boots, yelling something that got swallowed by the blasts. Davies slid into the dugout, blood already on his cheek. Direct hit on the latrine, he shouted, grinning madly. Best damn thing that ever happened to it. No one laughed. Not really, but it helped. Samuel gripped his helmet with both hands as the roof of the dugout creaked and dust rained down on them. Each blast shook the world a little harder than the last. Somewhere up the line, someone screamed. A scream that didn't end until it did. Up, Hargreaves barked, voice hard and level despite the thunder. Dig out the bastards. We've got men buried under the boards. They poured into the trench, stumbling as explosions threw mud and bodies into the air. The night sky flickered like lightning, lit by gun flashes and the glow of burning debris. Smoke filled Samuel's lungs as he dragged a shattered sandbag off a collapsed corner. A boot stuck out from beneath it, twitching. He dropped to his knees and dug with his bare hands. The mud was warm, sticky with something thicker than water. Jenkins helped him pull the man free. His eyes were open, mouth too, but he wasn't breathing. Another blast knocked them back against the wall. Samuel landed on his side, ears ringing. The sky turned white, then black again. He tasted blood. The bombardment went on for an hour, maybe more. Time didn't exist under shell fire. There was only the moment and the next explosion. When the guns finally stopped, it was like someone had slammed a door on hell. The sudden quiet made the silence unbearable. Smoke hung over the trench like fog. It carried the smell of sulfur, scorched wood, and burnt flesh. Samuel stood slowly, legs shaking, boots barely keeping him upright. His ears buzzed like a swarm of bees, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. The trench looked like it had been clawed open by giants. Whole sections were flattened. Bodies were everywhere. Some moved, most didn't. Jenkins leaned against the wall, panting. His right sleeve was soaked in blood, but he hadn't noticed. Samuel grabbed him by the shoulder. "You hit?" Jenkins looked down, then shrugged. "Don't feel a thing." Hargreaves appeared through the smoke, his face and uniform streaked with soot. He didn't say a word, just pointed toward the far end of the trench. Samuel followed. They passed a crater big enough to hide a horse. Inside, two men lay twisted, charred. One of them had no legs. The other was missing his jaw. Davies stood at the edge of the crater, staring down. He didn't move when Samuel walked up, didn't speak. He just stared. A medic brushed past them, face pale and eyes glassy. He carried a roll of bandages and not much else. There were too many wounded. Not enough supplies. Not enough time. They worked through the day, pulling bodies from the wreckage. Some were alive, most weren't. Samuel helped lift a boy, barely older than 16, onto a stretcher. His belly was torn open, and he moaned with every bump. His hands clutched a rosary, soaked in red. He died before they made it to the aid station. By sundown, the trench had quieted. A terrible kind of quiet. Not peace, never peace, just exhaustion. The dead had been piled near the rear slope, wrapped in canvas or nothing at all. Some faces were visible, some had no faces left. Samuel sat beside Jenkins, their backs against a timber post. Neither of them spoke. Words were meaningless now. Jenkins lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the flame barely catching in the wind. He passed it to Samuel, who took a long drag. It burned his throat, but it was warm. The ground beneath them was slick with more than just mud, but they didn't move. Across the trench, Davies was carving again. A new name. The list was getting longer. "You think they'll hit us again tonight?" Samuel asked quietly. Jenkins exhaled smoke through his nose. "Doesn't matter if they do." The stars came out late. Small, flickering. like they were watching. Samuel stared up at them and thought about home. He tried to remember what the sky looked like above Manchester, but he couldn't. Not clearly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw fire. Every time he blinked, he heard screaming. He knew he wouldn't sleep. None of them would. At some point, someone started singing. A low, cracked voice, an old hymn. Then another voice joined in, and another. It wasn't in tune, it wasn't pretty, but it was real. Samuel didn't sing, he just listened. He let the sound of broken voices carry him into the night. Dawn crept in, slow and colorless. There was no sunrise, no chorus of birds, just the low groan of wind against splintered boards and the tired shuffle of boots over ruined ground. Samuel sat alone, shoulders slumped, fingers wrapped around a tin cup of cold tea. He didn't drink it, he just held it, as if the warmth from yesterday might somehow return through the metal. The trench smelled worse now. The bombardment had turned the earth inside out, vomiting up pieces of men who'd been buried weeks ago. Flies clouded in swarms near every broken sandbag and every shallow grave that hadn't been dug deep enough. They buzzed in Samuel's ears, landed on his face. He didn't swat them away. Jenkins walked past, dragging a shovel behind him, eyes hollow. He'd been on burial duty since before dawn. 16 bodies so far, none of them whole. "Don't put faces to 'em," he muttered, not looking at Samuel. "Don't even try." Samuel nodded, though his mind refused to obey. He still saw the boy with the rosary, still heard his moan every time he blinked, still saw Murdoch's smile, still remembered the feel of that German's jacket as he helped lift the body over the parapet. More letters came, Davies said later, his voice strained, standing by the post with a handful of folded envelopes. He handed them out like rations, 2 for Jenkins, 1 for Davies himself. Nothing for Samuel. He didn't feel disappointed. Not really. He just felt emptier. "You want one of mine?" Jenkins asked, managing a small grin. "I've got too many words rattling around already." Samuel shook his head slowly, then walked away. The trench was still in ruins. They spent the day filling shell holes with broken planks and half-frozen mud. Everything leaked. Water pooled at the base of the walls. Boots squelched through it endlessly. No matter how much they fixed, it would fall apart again the next day. That was the rhythm of trench life. Destroy, rebuild, destroy again. Midday brought a visit from a chaplain, a short man in a black coat, face too clean, hands too soft. He moved through the trench with deliberate care, as if afraid of touching anything. He paused near the rear line, where the newest bodies were stacked under a tarp. "Anyone want to say a prayer?" he asked, voice barely audible. No one answered. Jenkins leaned on his shovel, sweat streaking through the dirt on his cheeks. "We said goodbye when they screamed," he muttered. "What's a prayer gonna do now?" Still the chaplain knelt. He read from a small Bible, words lost to the wind. Samuel watched him for a while, then turned away. That night, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the trench walls like a morning song. The fire step was slick with ice, the boards snapping beneath every boot step. Samuel pulled his greatcoat tighter around him and tried to focus on nothing. Not the mud, not the dead, not the cold, just nothing. But the brain doesn't work that way. It wanders, it scratches, it remembers. He saw his mother's hands in his mind, scrubbing potatoes in the kitchen sink. He heard the dog barking at birds in the garden. He imagined the smell of Sunday roast, the crackling fire, the ticking clock above the mantel. Then the images bled into other things. Murdoch's open mouth, a rat chewing on something soft, a screaming German with his intestines spilling out. He shook his head, hard, but the images stayed. He wasn't alone in that. Jenkins had started talking in his sleep, mumbling names no one knew, clutching his rifle even under blankets. Last night, he woke up screaming, swinging at nothing. It took Davies and Hargreaves to calm him down. "It's the waiting," Jenkins said afterward, wiping his face with shaking hands. "It's worse than the shells, worse than the fog, just sitting here, wondering when it's your turn." There were rumors that something was coming. The Germans were massing. A push, they said. Big one. Soon. Some believed it, some didn't. Samuel didn't care. He was already numb. Letters went unread. Food went untouched. Even the rats didn't bother him now. One morning, a new boy arrived. Couldn't have been more than 17. Too clean. Too hopeful. "Name's Peter," he said, grinning at everyone. "Just got in from Calais. They say we might be home by Easter." Jenkins looked at him like he was from another world. Easter was months away, and home might as well have been the moon. They gave the boy a shovel and pointed toward the collapsed section. He whistled as he worked. For an hour. Then the whistle stopped. Samuel found him sitting beside a half-dug latrine, head in his hands. His shovel lay in the mud, untouched. "They said it'd be an adventure," Peter whispered. "They didn't say it'd smell like this. No one said it would. No one said what war really was." That night, the sky stayed dark. No flares, no fire, but no peace either. Just the scratching of rats, the creak of broken boards, the slow breaking of mines. Samuel sat awake, watching the stars blink between coils of barbed wire. His fingers traced the edge of his bayonet without thinking. Not as a weapon, but as a comfort. It was sharp, real, unchanging, in a world where everything else was falling apart. By the time the frost set in, most of the men stopped feeling their fingers. Not just from the cold, but from the weight of repetition. Dig, stand guard, bury, wait, and always, always, the fear that never said its name out loud. Samuel woke before sunrise one morning, gasping for air. His dream had been filled with whispering voices and blinking eyes in the mud. He couldn't remember the words, just that they were coming from beneath the duckboards. He sat up, heart pounding, breath white in the cold. Jenkins was already awake, sitting across from him, cleaning his rifle with a rag that hadn't been white in weeks. "Bad one?" he asked without looking up. Samuel nodded slowly. "They're getting worse." Jenkins didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, they do that." That was all there was to say. By midweek, a strange tension hung over the trench, like the fog. No shells had fallen for days. No sniper fire. No machine gun chatter. Just silence. And it was that silence that drove the men deeper into their own heads. They started whispering about signs. Not orders, not strategy, signs. A rat that ran into the trench and turned back without crossing the duckboard. An owl that perched on the wire one night and hooted once before flying off. 3 soldiers saw it. 2 of them were dead within 48 hours. The third hadn't spoken since. Samuel didn't believe in omens. At least he didn't think he did. But something about the silence made everything feel unreal, unnatural. Even the mud seemed to breathe. They began to carry charms again. Bits of broken mirror. Shell casings from near misses. One man wore a sock around his neck, his baby daughter's tied like a scarf. Another carried a spoon, taken from a German corpse, tucked in his shirt like a relic. Jenkins swore by a bent coin he kept in his breast pocket. "Saw it stop a bullet in 16, he said. "Don't leave the trench without it." Samuel didn't laugh. No one laughed anymore. He kept his sister's letter folded in the same place, near his heart. It had gone soft and yellow from sweat and damp, but he touched it every morning before standing watch, and every night before sleep. There was a new story going around about a ghost that walked the wire after midnight. A tall man in a French uniform with no face. Some swore they'd seen him just before a gas attack. Others claimed he whispered their names from the dark. Peter, the fresh-faced boy from Calais, said he'd seen him too. 3 nights in a row, always standing just beyond the barbed wire, still as a statue. Jenkins didn't believe him. "Kid's just rattled," he muttered. "Give him a few more weeks. He won't be seeing anything except the inside of his own skull." But Samuel wasn't so sure. The trench made strange things feel possible. When every sunrise might be your last, belief became its own kind of defense. Hargreaves found chalk drawings on the trench wall one morning. Strange circles, lines within lines, symbols none of them recognized. No one claimed them. They washed them off, but by the next night, they were back. Samuel saw them again 2 days later, near the latrine post, this time drawn in blood. He didn't report it. The medic had started carrying whiskey in a canteen. He offered it freely now, not bothering with excuses. "Cuts the cold," he'd say, but his hands shook too badly to pour, without spilling it all over the ground. One afternoon, Samuel found Davies staring into a puddle beside the mess area. He didn't blink for several minutes. "What are you looking at?" Samuel asked. Davies pointed into the water. "I saw Murdoch," he whispered. "He was in the puddle. Said he was cold. Said the mud's too tight down there." Samuel knelt beside him. The puddle reflected only sky and wire, but he didn't say so. "Come on," he said gently. "We'll get you some tea." Davies followed, silent. By week's end, the whispers had returned. Louder now, closer. Samuel heard them while standing guard. They drifted over the parapet like breath. They didn't say his name, not at first. Then one night, they did. He spun with his rifle, bayonet gleaming, eyes wide. Nothing, just fog and silence. Jenkins found him 10 minutes later, still frozen. "You see him?" Jenkins asked. "The man with no face?" Samuel nodded slowly. He didn't know if he was lying. That night, he didn't sleep. Hargreaves held a meeting the next day, brief and grim. "We're being relieved for 2 days," he said. "Pull back to the dugouts near the old farmhouse. Rest up, refit, then we're back in." No one cheered, but there was relief in their eyes, even if just for a moment. They marched out at dusk, boots dragging through fresh mud, past the line of graves, past the wreckage of collapsed boards and twisted wire, past the place where the chalk drawings had returned again. They didn't stop to look. The farmhouse was half burned, windows boarded, roof gone, but the cellar was dry. Mostly. They took their places on the floor, laid out in rows like forgotten tools. Jenkins fell asleep first, snoring gently. Peter followed, curled like a child. Samuel stayed awake. The cellar walls felt too close, too quiet. He stared at the ceiling. Watched shadows move that shouldn't have moved. Somewhere in the dark, he heard breathing that wasn't his. Not Jenkins, not Peter, something else. He closed his eyes, tried to recite his sister's letter from memory. "Dear Sam, I hope you're keeping warm." The words blurred. He drifted into sleep, but it wasn't peace, it was a descent. He saw faces without eyes, wire wrapped around limbs like snakes, mud rising, choking, pulling men down like a tide. He woke with a gasp, heart racing. Jenkins stirred beside him, eyes fluttering. Peter sat up straight, shivering, whispering something into the dark. "We're not alone down here." Samuel didn't ask what he meant, because he already knew. The brief relief they had barely tasted slipped through their fingers like water. No sooner had they settled into the damp cellar near the ruined farmhouse than the sharp crackle of orders pulled them back to the front. No rest, no pause, no mercy. Samuel folded his thin, threadbare blanket with shaking hands, his fingers stiff and numb from the cold that bit through every layer of clothing. The weight of his pack felt heavier than before. Inside, the few precious items he'd held onto, his sister's letter, a dull bayonet, a worn ration tin, seemed to carry the weight of the world itself. The cold cellar walls dripped with moisture, and the air smelled stale and musty. He wondered if the chill in his bones would ever leave him, if the war would ever let him go. The men moved out in silence. The mud swallowed their boots, sucking at their steps as if the earth itself tried to pull them down. A soft drizzle slicked the wooden boards overhead, each drop echoing softly in the trench like tiny footsteps. Samuel felt the weight of the silence pressing down, harder than the guns, the kind of silence that screamed louder than any explosion. Jenkins lit a cigarette with trembling hands. The ember glowed fiercely against the grey backdrop. He took a long drag, exhaling smoke into the fog. "They're waiting for us," he muttered, voice low and rough, "like wolves, crouched and ready to tear us apart." No one answered. No one dared argue. They all knew the truth of it. Night fell with a crushing heaviness. The fog rolled in, thick and fast. It crept along the trench walls, wrapping around faces and rifles. It swallowed sound and swallowed light, like it was alive, like it wanted to hide something or someone. Samuel crouched low on the fire step, his rifle pressed tight to his shoulder. Cold bit through every inch of him. Mud filled his boots and squished between his fingers as he gripped the stock. Around him, men whispered prayers or cursed the waiting. Each breath was a mist in the freezing air. His heart hammered in his chest, pounding out a frantic rhythm. Suddenly, a sharp flare screamed into the sky, red as fresh blood. It lit the trench for a single, terrible moment. Then darkness swallowed it whole. The world erupted. Machine guns spat fire in relentless rhythm. Rifles cracked sharp and deafening. The smell of cordite stung Samuel's nose. Shells exploded nearby, ripping holes in the earth and sending showers of mud and shrapnel into the night. Samuel's heart pounded louder than the guns. His hands shook as he squeezed the trigger. Recoil slammed into his shoulder. He fired blindly into the fog. Bullets sang past his ears. A man collapsed beside him, clutching his chest, blood blooming like a dark, awful flower. Jenkins shouted his name, but the roar of battle swallowed the sound. Dark shapes emerged, crawling through the barbed wire, enemies slipping like ghosts closer and closer. Whispers of movement, screams ripped from throats raw with fear. Samuel lunged forward, bayonet fixed and trembling in his grip. His boot caught on something soft and slick. He stumbled, fell into the mud. A body twisted beneath him. He pushed himself up, stabbed wildly into the dark. The man's eyes were wide with terror. Samuel barely felt the wet crunch as steel met flesh. A scream pierced the night, a scream sharp and final. Another volley of gunfire erupted, the trench filled with gun smoke and cries. Men fell and rose again, desperate to hold the line. The enemy pushed hard, pushed until the trench shook with the fury of battle. Samuel's vision blurred. Blood spattered across his face. The mud beneath his knees was slick with it. Bodies piled up, friend and foe alike. Faces distorted in death. Mouths frozen open in silent screams. The night stretched on, endless, brutal. Explosions shattered the sky. Grenades hissed and burst in the trench. Air thick with dust, sweat, and fear. Jenkins was beside him, pale and shaking. "Hold on," he whispered fiercely. "We've got to hold on." Samuel nodded, though his limbs felt leaden. He fought not just for survival, but for the ghosts of those lost, for the letters folded in his pocket, for the home that seemed to slip farther with every heartbeat. The enemy line finally broke, retreating into the fog from which they had come, leaving behind the trench littered with dead and dying. Silence fell, deafening and terrible. Dawn bled into the sky, pink and cold. A cruel reminder that morning had come, that they had survived. For now, Samuel sank against the trench wall, body trembling from exhaustion and shock. Jenkins lit a cigarette, the fragile ember a small, defiant glow in the pale light. "We're lucky to be here," he said quietly, "but luck doesn't last forever." Samuel stared at the bloodied ground, the mangled bodies, broken rifles, the endless mud. The weight of it all settled deep inside. Endless fighting, endless waiting, endless loss. Around them, men tried to catch their breath. Some cried softly, others stared blankly into nothing. No one spoke of the dead. No one named the missing. The line held, for now. But Samuel knew the war wasn't done with them yet. The day after the night raid stretched out like a wound that refused to heal. The trench felt hollow, like a broken shell tossed aside by the storm. Men moved like ghosts, shadows with flesh, their faces pale, eyes vacant. The silence that filled the space was not peace, it was exhaustion, and something far darker. Samuel sat heavily beside a torn sandbag, his rifle resting across his knees. His fingers trembled, tracing the worn wood absently. He tried to call back the feel of his mother's hands, the soft, warm touch that once soothed his childhood fears. But those images slipped farther with each passing day, replaced by the cold, wet mud, by nightmares, by the smell of death and fear. Jenkins stood a few feet away, staring blankly at a ragged hole in the trench wall. He flicked a cigarette butt into the mud without looking. "No one talks about what they saw last night," he muttered quietly. "Not the screams, not the faces." Samuel nodded silently. He could not forget the way enemy eyes had glowed with something feral in the darkness, the scent of fear mixed with smoke and blood. He wondered if the ghosts of the fallen still wandered the trench, if their voices haunted the wire and the mud. Whispers began to swirl among the men, tales of curses, of shadows moving just out of sight, of footsteps heard in the tangled wire. Some claimed to see figures lurking in the fog, silhouettes with hollow eyes watching from the darkness. Samuel heard the stories, but spoke little. Fear was contagious. Silence was the only shield left. Peter, the wide-eyed boy from Calais, pulled Samuel aside one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw someone in the fog," he confessed. "A soldier. But his face, it wasn't right, like it was melting away, like it was missing." Samuel stared at him. He wanted to tell Peter it was just the fear playing tricks, but deep inside, he knew the war twisted minds, made the impossible feel real, made the dead reach out with unseen hands. Sleep was fractured. Dreams tore at the edges of his mind. Shouts echoed through endless mud. Faces with no eyes, bodies sinking in the earth. He woke with a pounding heart. The line between nightmare and waking blurred like the fog outside. One cold evening, Hargreaves called the men together. His voice was low, hard. He spoke of a patrol to cross no man's land, a dangerous mission to gather intelligence from enemy lines, a reminder that they were still alive, still fighting. Samuel's stomach twisted. The thought of leaving the relative shelter of the trench was terrifying. But orders left no choice. They prepared quickly, checked weapons, readied grenades, took deep, steadying breaths. The patrol was small. Jenkins, Peter, Davies, and Samuel. They moved quietly, shadows in the darkness. Every step measured and cautious. Crossing no man's land was like walking through a graveyard, the earth littered with broken bodies, twisted and cold, some still clutching shattered rifles, others frozen in final moments of terror. Samuel's eyes fixed to the mud beneath his feet. He forced himself to breathe, to move, to not look at the hand reaching from the muck, the face half buried in dirt, a silent plea for mercy that would never come. Suddenly, a twig snapped. A shadow flickered in the fog. Jenkins raised his rifle, finger tense on the trigger. The shadow vanished into the night. They pressed on, tense, alert, the silence around them heavier than before. The patrol returned with little to report, but the journey left its mark, an invisible darkness settling deep in their hearts. Back in the trench, rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers of a massive enemy, push coming soon, a final blow to break the line, to wipe them all away. The men prepared desperately, checked and rechecked their weapons, reinforced walls with sandbags and timber, held quiet prayers or cursed their fate. Samuel lay awake under the thin canvas of his tent. The stars glimmered faintly above the wire. He wondered if he would see another sunrise, if the war would ever end, if he would ever return home. Sleep did not come easily. He heard whispers, faint voices, calling from the dark, calling his name, calling the names of those long gone. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to shut out the voices, but they only grew louder. The walls seemed to breathe. The mud seemed alive. When morning came, the trench was still, too still. The calm before a storm that none dared speak of aloud. The morning after the patrol broke the uneasy silence that had settled over the trenches like a suffocating blanket. The fog hung low and thick over the shattered earth, a dense mist that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. Even the birds had vanished, their songs silenced by the cold and the constant threat of death. No wind stirred the ragged canvas flaps overhead. Only the steady drip of water from broken boards echoed through the trench, a slow, relentless rhythm that matched the aching in Samuel's bones. He sat heavily against the sodden trench wall. His fingers cracked and raw from the cold and constant mud, absently traced the worn wood of his rifle. His eyes were fixed on the swirling mist beyond the barbed wire, where the world seemed caught between reality and nightmare. The mud, the wire, the endless horizon, all blurred in the grey light. It was a place suspended between life and death, between hope and despair. Jenkins shuffled nearby, his movements slow and deliberate. He struck a match, the tiny flare of orange light briefly illuminating his weathered, haunted face. The smoke curled upward, mingling with the mist. "We all know it's coming," he muttered, voice low and rough. "A push, a big one that could tear us apart." No one spoke. The words hung heavy like a shadow over the trench, an unspoken dread settling deep into every heart. The men went about their tasks in silence, knowing this was no ordinary day. This was the calm before the storm. Orders came down mid-morning to reinforce the line, to prepare for the worst. The men moved like ghosts, hauling sandbags with aching limbs. The weight of each bag was nothing compared to the weight of the fear in their hearts. Barbed wire was stretched tighter, twisted into cruel knots. Every man worked silently, driven by a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and grim determination. The food rations were meager, spoons scraped at thin, watery stews that barely warmed the stomach, bitter, cold, and unappetizing. But survival demanded they eat. Appetite was a distant memory. The mud grew thicker with every passing rain. Boots sank deeper. Water pooled in every crevice. It was cold and unyielding, a constant reminder of their fragile hold on life. Sleep was a rare luxury. When it came, it was restless and broken, haunted by shadows and the screams of comrades lost. The boundary between nightmare and waking blurred like the fog outside the trench. Samuel woke often, heart pounding in the quiet hours. His thoughts drifted endlessly to home, to a small, warm kitchen filled with light and laughter, the scent of baking bread, the sound of his sister's voice chasing their dog across the garden. Those memories were both a comfort and a torment. They slipped further with each passing day, yet still held him tethered to something beyond the mud and blood. The days passed in a haze of grey. Shells exploded at irregular intervals, sometimes dangerously close, sometimes distant enough to ignore for a moment, but always there, the relentless reminder of death's presence. Snipers took their toll, quiet, deadly shots from hidden perches, a sharp crack, a body falling, silence, whispers of another lost soul. The enemy watched and waited, predators cloaked in fog and shadow. The wolves Jenkins had warned them about. One night, a small fire flickered dimly in a dugout, a rare, fragile warmth in the endless cold. Men gathered close, sharing stories of better times, of places far from mud and blood, of hopes that seemed almost impossible now. Peter spoke softly of his village in Calais, fields green with wheat and sunflowers stretching to golden horizons, sunsets that set the sky ablaze with fire and color. Samuel listened, feeling the sharp pang of longing, yet beneath it, a flicker of fragile hope stirred. Jenkins stared silently into the flames, his face set hard, unreadable. "I don't think I'll see another summer," he said quietly, "but I'll fight to my last breath." The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the trench walls. One by one, the men drifted off to restless sleep, leaving Samuel alone with the silence, with the weight of all that had happened and all that was yet to come. He thought of the letters tucked safely in his breast pocket, words from a world that felt impossibly distant. He traced their edges with dirty fingers, clinging to those fragile threads of connection. Morning came slow and grey, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain, the air thick with anticipation. Soldiers moved about, checking weapons, sharpening bayonets, exchanging solemn, knowing glances. Samuel felt a cold dread settle deep in his stomach. The calm before the storm, the moment when everything changes, when the thin thread of life snaps under pressure. He wondered if he was ready, if any of them were, if home was just a dream. The hours dragged on endlessly. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Every sound was amplified, Every shadow seemed to twist and shift. The distant rumble of artillery grew steadily louder, a terrible drumbeat that promised fire and death. Men readied themselves. Whispers of prayer floated through the trench. Samuel tightened the straps on his pack, checked the bayonet's edge one last time. He glanced around at his comrades, faces etched with fatigue, fear, but also an unyielding determination. The trench seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The night before the assault weighed heavy on the trenches like an oppressive shroud. A stillness unlike any other wrapped itself around the battered earth. The dark sky, smeared with thick clouds, threatened rain that would only add to the endless mud. A cold wind whispered through the wire, carrying the scent of damp earth, smoke, and something far darker. Men moved silently among the shadows, their figures ghost-like in the dim light, faces pale, eyes hollowed by months of unrelenting mud, terror, and relentless waiting. The faint flicker of candlelight from scattered dugouts cast long, trembling shadows on the trench walls. Some men whispered hurried prayers, others cursed softly to themselves. All carried within them the crushing weight of knowledge. At dawn, they would charge into the abyss. Samuel lay huddled in a shallow dugout, the thin canvas roof above offering little protection from the creeping cold. His fingers, raw and cracked from the cold and the unforgiving mud, traced absently over the worn wood of his rifle. His eyes stared into the void of darkness beyond the trench, thoughts swirling like the restless mist outside. Would he see another sunrise? Would the war's end ever come before it claimed them all? Nearby, Jenkins sat rigid, eyes fixed on the flickering candle flame, his jaw clenched tight. Though his hands were steady, his eyes betrayed a storm of fear and sorrow. "I don't want to die like this," he whispered, voice hoarse and low, "not forgotten, buried in mud and silence." Samuel reached out, gripping Jenkins's arm with strength he barely felt. "We'll get through this. We have to." But even as the words left his lips, the earth began to tremble beneath them. A distant rumble grew steadily louder, rolling like thunder across the shattered landscape. The artillery barrage had begun. Explosions erupted like deadly flowers blooming across no man's land. Shells tore through the earth, ripping massive craters, hurling dirt, shrapnel, and bodies skyward. The ground shook violently beneath their feet. Men ducked and covered their heads as the world around them exploded into chaos. The acrid smell of burning cordite filled the air, mingling with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Orders came suddenly, sharp as a knife. Over the top, men scrambled from the trenches, boots sinking deep into the thick, sucking mud. Hearts pounded wildly against ribs. Samuel swallowed the lump of dread lodged in his throat and tightened his grip on his rifle. Bayonet fixed, every muscle tensed, ready to leap. A whistle pierced the chaos, clear, sharp, final. The signal that shattered the fragile line between life and death. Men surged forward like a relentless tide of flesh and steel. Faces set hard, eyes burning with fierce determination. Voices lost beneath the thunderous roar of guns and explosions. The mud clung to their boots, dragging them down, but never stopping their desperate charge. Bullets sliced through the cold dawn like invisible blades. Machine guns spat death in unending streams. Explosions ripped through the earth around them, hurling bodies and dirt into the air. The screams of the wounded and dying blended into a horrific symphony. Samuel's world narrowed to a single agonizing moment. One step at a time, one breath, one heartbeat. He saw Jenkins fall, struck down by a hail of bullets. A cry tore from Samuel's throat, But there was no time to stop. He forced himself onward, each step heavier than the last, weighted by grief and desperation. The enemy's trenches rose ahead like jagged wounds in the earth. Barbed wire fences, twisted and torn, obstacles to death. Men scrambled over, bayonets flashing under the pale light, faces contorted in terror and rage. The fight that followed was savage beyond words. Close quarters combat, where every second was a battle for survival. Fists smashed into flesh, rifles swung wildly, bayonets plunged deep. Blood and mud mingled in a brutal dance, slick and unrelenting. Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into an eternity of chaos and carnage. The roar of guns, the shouts of men, and the explosions merged into one overwhelming nightmare. Samuel's strength began to fail. His lungs burned with each ragged breath. Around him, comrades fell like flies, some screaming in agony, others silent forever. The faces of the dead haunted him, flickering at the edges of his vision. He fought with desperation, born of sheer will. The enemy line finally cracked under the assault. Men screamed as they fled into the mist and ruins. But the cost was terrible and unforgiving. The trench was strewn with bodies, broken weapons, and shattered lives. Samuel collapsed into the mud, chest heaving, body trembling with exhaustion and shock. The ground beneath him was slick with blood and water. His hands shook uncontrollably as he pressed them to his face, trying to block out the horror. He closed his eyes, willing peace to find him, to end the endless nightmare. Night fell once more, wrapping the battlefield in a cold, suffocating darkness. The thunder of battle faded into distant echoes. Samuel lay among the wounded and the dead, wondering if survival was a curse or a blessing, if he had lost everything worth living for. Above him, the stars blinked coldly, indifferent witnesses to the endless carnage below. Samuel felt the crushing weight of all that had happened settle deep within his bones. The mud, the screams, the faces of those lost. He was alive, but at what cost? The dawn crept slowly over the shattered wasteland, a pale grey light struggling through heavy clouds. The air hung thick and choking with the bitter scent of gunpowder, mingled with the coppery tang of blood and the damp earth. Samuel's eyes fluttered open to the cold mud pressing against his cheek, his body aching from the relentless violence of the night before. All around him lay the silent dead. Comrades, strangers, enemies, faces frozen in the final moments of terror and pain. He tried to swallow the lump of grief rising in his throat, but the weight of it was crushing. Slowly, with stiff limbs, he pushed himself upright, every movement a protest of muscles and bone. The world was eerie in its stillness, the battlefield quiet, as if holding its breath in mourning. The distant groans of wounded men pierced the silence, reminders that life stubbornly clung on. Jenkins was gone. The cruel finality of his absence echoed inside Samuel's chest, like a hollow drum. He reached out, fingers brushing cold mud that was dark with blood where Jenkins had fallen. The image of his friend's face flashed in his mind. Fierce, determined, then still forever. Samuel blinked away the tears threatening to fall, swallowed hard. He knew the war would steal many more like Jenkins. Around him, the survivors moved like ghosts, their faces etched with exhaustion, horror, and disbelief. Some tended the wounded with gentle hands, masking their own despair. Others scavenged for supplies amid the debris of shattered rifles and broken helmets. Every movement was heavy with the burden of what had just occurred. Samuel found himself helping carry a stretcher. A young private wrapped in a bloodied blanket, limp and pale. The boy's face was eerily peaceful now, the fear and pain of his last moments erased by death's cold mercy. Samuel's heart clenched, wondering how many more lives would be claimed before this nightmare ended. The trench itself, once a refuge from the storm of war, now felt like a tomb. Mud clung to boots and uniforms with a relentless grip. Water pooled in every hollow, cold and unyielding. The stench of decay mingled with the stifling smell of sweat and cordite. Rats scurried shamelessly, emboldened by the carnage, nibbling at corpses and supplies alike. Despite the devastation and grief, the war pressed on without mercy. Orders arrived swiftly and without sympathy. The men were to hold the line at all costs, to prepare for the counterattack that was certain to come. There was no time to grieve, no moment to pause, only the desperate fight to survive. Days melted into one another, a grim procession of mud, blood, and endless waiting. Shells rained down without warning, exploding in thunderous blasts that rattled bones and shattered minds. Snipers lurked in ruined buildings and tangled wire, picking off those brave or foolish enough to expose themselves. The men lived in a world of shadows and fear, clinging to whatever scraps of sanity they could find. Samuel sought brief refuge in small, fragile routines, writing letters home by the flickering candlelight, pouring his soul into the ink-stained pages, sharing whispered conversations with Peter, the young boy from Calais, their voices soft amid the chaos, finding rare moments of laughter, a brief balm for the weary heart. But the waiting was the cruelest torment of all. Time stretched endlessly, each day mirroring the last, in endless monotony and dread. The constant threat of death hung over every breath, every step, every heartbeat. Hope became a fragile thread, easily snapped by a stray bullet or an exploding shell. At night, Samuel lay awake beneath the threadbare canvas of his shelter, staring at the starless sky hidden behind thick clouds. He wondered if this endless limbo was worse than the fury of battle itself, if the war would ever end, if he would ever feel the warmth of his mother's embrace again. The trench had become a world apart, a nightmare realm where life and death danced on a razor's edge, where the line between sanity and madness blurred with each passing day. Samuel clenched his fists tightly, vowing silently to survive, to carry the memory of those who had fallen forward with him, to live on for those who could no longer. The war was far from over, but in these quiet, desperate moments between storms, the men grasped at the fragile, flickering flame of hope. The trench was a world apart from everything Samuel had ever known. It was a place where time bent and folded back on itself, where days melted into nights and nights blurred endlessly into days. The relentless rain fell like a curse from the sky, drumming a mournful rhythm on the battered earth and turning every step into a fight against the sucking mud. Above, the sky was an unchanging expanse of leaden grey, casting a pale and sorrowful light over a land scarred by endless violence. The air hung thick with the choking scents of gunpowder, decaying flesh, and earth torn asunder by the ceaseless thunder of artillery. A cold wind moaned like a restless ghost, winding through broken trees and shattered ruins, carrying with it the silent cries of the fallen. Each morning, Samuel awoke with aching limbs and a heart heavy with grief. He climbed from his cramped, sodden dugout, the cold mud swallowing his boots with each step. The trench seemed to pull him deeper into its grasp, as though it wished to imprison him in its nightmare forever. His uniform was stiff with dirt and soaked through with rain, clinging to his skin like a second layer of cold despair. Every breath was thick with the bitter taste of blood, sweat, and the acrid sting of fear. The distant cries of wounded men echoed like tortured spirits through the mist that shrouded no man's land. Rats swarmed beneath the wooden planks and along the trench walls, their eyes gleaming like malevolent embers in the dim light. They gnawed relentlessly at whatever they could find: scraps of food, exposed flesh of the dead, and sometimes the living who lay still too long. Samuel slapped at them in the dead of night when their tiny claws crept too close, their presence a constant, nauseating reminder of decay and rot. These rats were as much a part of the war as the guns and shells, scavengers thriving on death and despair. Yet the men fought fiercely to preserve their humanity amidst the horrors. They whispered jokes in the darkness, coaxing laughter from weary hearts like fragile sparks in a storm. Letters from home were treasured beyond words, read aloud by candlelight, with voices trembling from exhaustion and longing. Songs were hummed softly beneath breaths, their melodies fragile and wavering but fiercely alive. Peter, the youngest among them, found a small patch of wildflowers stubbornly growing near the edge of the ruined woods. With trembling hands, he plucked a few delicate blooms and tucked them carefully into his worn jacket. This splash of living color amidst the endless mud and ruin was a miracle, a secret hope. Samuel watched him, feeling a rare warmth flicker inside, a beacon of fragile light in the suffocating darkness. But despair lurked ever near, a shadow that stretched with every passing moment. Shellfire could begin anew without warning, ripping flesh and bone from earth with brutal finality. Mines lay buried, silent and deadly, ready to swallow men whole in a sudden eruption of fire and death. The enemy sniper waited patiently in ruined buildings, cold and unblinking, delivering death from afar with lethal precision. One damp grey morning, a messenger arrived with news that stirred the men's battered souls. Whispers of peace talks, distant negotiations that might end the unending slaughter. A flicker of excitement passed among the weary ranks. Could this nightmare finally be drawing to a close? Yet hope was a fragile and dangerous thing. It made the endless waiting more unbearable. Every crack of distant gunfire, every shifting shadow, every rumble of artillery became a tormenting question. Would this be the moment they would lose everything? Samuel found his gaze drawn again and again to a small, worn photograph nestled in his breast pocket, a faded image of his mother, her gentle smile a tether to a world far removed from mud and blood. He traced its edges with trembling fingers, drawing strength from the memory of warmth, love, and home. The war raged around them with relentless cruelty, but within the trenches, amid mud, blood, and fear, the men clung to moments of humanity and fragile beauty. They shared scarce meals with grateful hearts, each bite a small victory against hunger and despair. Quiet conversations sparked dreams of life beyond the battlefield, of sunlit fields, laughter, and peace. Visions of home that seemed almost mythical, yet burned bright in their hearts like an eternal flame. Weeks bled into months, and the men grew weary beyond measure. Some fell victim to illness, trench fever, dysentery, and the creeping madness that clouded the mind like an endless fog. Others succumbed to despair, spirits broken beneath the crushing weight of loss and horror. But Samuel clung fiercely to his will to live, a stubborn flame burning against the dark, a promise to carry forward the memories of those lost, to return to the world beyond the trenches, to honor the fallen with survival. One evening, as the sun sank low behind heavy clouds, turning the sky to bruised purples and muted golds, Samuel and Peter sat side by side on a muddy embankment, watching the fading light in companionable silence. For a brief, precious moment, the war felt distant, a shadow of a memory rather than a living nightmare. Peter turned to Samuel, his young face bright with fragile hope. "Do you think it will end soon?" he asked softly, voice barely louder than the whispering wind. Samuel smiled faintly, unsure but aching to believe. "I hope so, lad. I hope so." The trench was a place of haunting contradictions, a tomb and a sanctuary, a prison and a home. Within its battered walls, the men forged bonds stronger than steel, brotherhood born of shared suffering, tempered by fire and blood. Strength drawn from the flickering flame of hope, held stubbornly against the encroaching darkness. The trench lay engulfed in a suffocating cloak of darkness, so thick it swallowed every whisper and every breath. The cold night air cut like 1,000 shards of ice through the threadbare uniforms and tattered coats of the men huddled within. Samuel crouched low against the mud-slicked wall, his breath forming fleeting clouds that vanished into the frigid air. Above, the stars were hidden behind a heavy curtain of clouds, leaving the world beneath steeped in an unyielding grey. The distant rolling thunder of artillery echoed across the shattered landscape, a grim heartbeat that reminded all below that the war never rested. Men moved silently through the trench, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and the hollow weight of too many sleepless nights. Each step was cautious, measured, as though even the slightest noise might summon death from the shadows. Some stared blankly ahead, eyes glazed with the numbing fog of trauma and endless waiting. Others muttered prayers under their breath, clutching weathered letters from home or worn talismans, desperate for any scrap of hope or protection. Samuel's fingers trembled as he meticulously checked his rifle one final time. The cold gnawed into his skin, but his hands were numb, stiff with fatigue that no brief rest could ease. He glanced sideways at Peter, who sat beside him, pale-cheeked and wide-eyed, his youthful face a fragile mix of terror and steely resolve. No words were exchanged, but the weight of shared fate pressed heavily between them, a silent pact of survival. The night stretched on without end, a vast, oppressive weight pressing down on every heartbeat and breath. Time slowed to a crawl, each second stretching into the next like a sluggish river of dread and despair. In the distance, enemy trenches lay eerily quiet, just as tense and watchful as the men poised to strike. Samuel's mind churned with memories, the faces of comrades fallen too soon, laughter from distant brighter days, letters never sent, and dreams deferred. He pictured home, sunlight filtering through trees, the scent of blooming flowers, the warmth of his mother's embrace. Would he ever see those things again? Could this endless nightmare possibly end before it consumed him? Then, suddenly, a sharp whistle cut through the night air, piercing and final. A signal. The moment they dreaded had arrived. Orders came swiftly, whispered in urgent clipped tones. Men scrambled to their feet, hearts hammering in frantic rhythm with the distant roar of guns. Bayonets were fixed, rifles gripped with white-knuckled intensity, faces set in grim, unyielding determination. Samuel drew a deep, burning breath, the cold air filling his lungs with fiery resolve. He glanced at Peter, who met his gaze with a silent plea for courage and strength. With a solemn nod, they surged forward together. Climbing out of the trench was like emerging from a tomb into a hellscape of chaos. The world beyond was a twisted nightmare of mud, broken barbed wire, shattered trees, and smoke-choked air. Shells exploded in brutal, fiery bursts all around them, sending earth, bodies, and jagged shrapnel flying through the air like deadly rain. Machine guns spat merciless streams of death, cutting down men before they could take more than a step. Samuel ran, boots sinking deep into sucking mud, muscles screaming with exertion and terror. The air was thick with acrid smoke and the anguished screams of the wounded and dying, a cacophony of horror that echoed in his ears. His bayonet flashed cold and bright as he lunged forward, fighting fiercely for every inch of ground, every breath of life. Time collapsed into a maelstrom of noise, pain, and desperate survival instinct. He saw Peter fall beside him, struck down by a bullet that tore through flesh and shattered bone. A raw, primal scream tore from Samuel's throat, wrenching his very soul. But there was no time to stop. The enemy line was reached, and savage, brutal hand-to-hand combat erupted with ferocious intensity. Fists smashed into faces, rifles were swung like clubs, bayonets plunged deep into flesh. Blood mixed with mud in a choking, viscous slurry that slicked the earth beneath the feet of men locked in mortal struggle. Samuel's entire world shrank to the desperate fight for survival. Each breath, each heartbeat was a battle against pain, exhaustion, and the all-consuming shadow of death. Hours passed in a haze of fury and sheer will. At last, the first pale light of dawn broke over the blood-soaked battlefield. The guns fell silent, replaced by the moans of the wounded, the groans of the dying, and the ragged breathing of the living. Samuel collapsed to the ground, soaked in mud and blood, body trembling from exhaustion, shock, and grief. He had survived the long night of horror, but the cost was terrible beyond words. The long night was over, but the war was far from finished. The distant rumble of fresh artillery warned that the battle's storm was not yet spent. The first fragile light of dawn broke over the war-ravaged horizon. Its soft glow spilled slowly across the scarred earth, painting the shattered trenches and battered bodies in hues of pale gold and muted rose. The sky, once heavy with bruised purples and stormy grays, now softened into gentle blues, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something beyond the horror to begin. Samuel lay motionless where he had fallen, his body aching with exhaustion, every limb heavy as if weighted by the ghost of the night. Around him, the terrible aftermath of battle stretched in all directions, a silent testament to pain, loss, and the unyielding will to survive. The mud beneath him was thick and cold, slick with rain and blood, the earth stained by countless lives lost and dreams shattered. Bodies lay strewn about, faces pale and frozen in the final moments of terror and defiance. Rifles still clutched in lifeless hands, uniforms torn and stained with dirt and gore. The bitter scent of death hung thick and choking in the air, mingling with the dampness and the acrid smoke that curled lazily upward from still smoldering shell craters. The moans and cries of the wounded echoed painfully across the barren wasteland, a mournful chorus that pierced the cold morning. Samuel's breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate effort. Each movement sent sharp jolts of pain through his battered body, but he forced himself upright, driven by the stubborn will to live. His eyes scanned the horizon desperately, searching for comrades, for any sign of life amid the devastation. Peter's absence struck him like a blow. The boy who had shared his fears and hopes, the fleeting moments of fragile beauty, was gone. A lump formed in Samuel's throat as he swallowed the crushing sorrow, the memory of Peter's bright eyes forever etched in his mind. he whispered a silent vow to carry the memory of the fallen with him, to honor their sacrifice by surviving. Slowly, the trench began to stir with movement. Survivors emerged from dugouts and shell holes, faces drawn and pale, bodies trembling with cold, shock, and disbelief. Officers barked orders, their voices rough and urgent as they struggled to rally the shattered men. Though this night's battle had ended, the war was far from over. The distant rumble of fresh artillery warned that the next storm was already gathering. Samuel moved through the shattered trench, offering what comfort and aid he could, sharing water from scarce supplies, offering bandages for bleeding wounds, words of reassurance in the midst of chaos. Each act of kindness was a fragile lifeline in the sea of suffering. Every man carried his own scars, tau, visible wounds that bled and throbbed, and invisible ones buried deep in the soul. They were brothers forged in fire and blood, bound together by shared torment and the flickering hope of peace. As the sun climbed higher, the cold morning slowly gave way to a hesitant warmth. The distant artillery fire intensified, signaling the grim preparations for another assault. Orders came down to ready for the inevitable next wave of violence. Samuel's heart clenched tightly with dread, but he steeled himself. A soldier shaped by suffering and resilience. In a rare, quiet moment, Samuel closed his eyes. He reached deep inside for memories of better days, the laughter of children playing in sun-drenched fields, the scent of blooming flowers in spring, the tender embrace of family and home. These memories were his shield against the encroaching darkness, his reason to endure the relentless nightmare. Around him, whispers of hope and dreams of peace passed from man to man. The yearning for an end to the bloodshed, for the day when the guns would fall silent and life might bloom anew. They clung to these dreams with fierce determination, fragile candles flickering against the vast night. Samuel knew the war would continue, but so would he. For as long as breath filled his lungs and hope sparked within his heart, he would stand. He would fight not only with rifle and bayonet, but with the spirit that refused to be broken. He thought of the dawn yet to come, not just the morning light now breaking, but the dawn of reckoning that would one day end this suffering. A world rebuilt from the ashes, where children could laugh without fear and love could flourish unshadowed by war. That dawn was distant and uncertain, but it was real, and it was worth every agonizing step, every shattered dream, every sacrifice. As the sun fully rose, bathing the broken earth and battered souls in warm light, Samuel rose with it, determined to face whatever horrors awaited with unyielding courage. For he was more than a soldier trapped in a muddy trench. He was a bearer of hope, a survivor, and a witness to the unbreakable strength of the human spirit.